All right. So while she's coming into this room, I just wanted to welcome you. Thank you for joining. I am here because I think it's time to move in some direction. We don't know what the right direction is right now to end racial hatred, but I feel like sitting on my hands is not doing anything. I feel like discussions and small conversations, time after time, really help to kind of change the paradigm, increase people's perspective. I feel it's important to have conversation, but also conversation that's actionable to think about how do we do our part within our sphere of influence to make a difference. So that's why I started these chats around reprogramming America, because we've been programmed to think like this. We've been programmed to think in terms of racial hierarchies, whether it's known to us or unknown to us. We have unconscious biases. We have internalized and targeted racism that is just a part of our life, a part of our culture. So it's really important to kind of do something about it. And it's not about blame. It's about recognizing that, everyone in our country is impacted negatively by racism, and we have to push through the pain to the power, as I quote Ayanna Pressley again, and look for opportunities to speak truth to power. Anti-racism and the work that it involves is a long journey. It's a road that you have to take steps towards. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens both at the grassroots level through small conversations like the one we're going to have tonight. And it also happens through policy changes and systemic change. And sometimes these small conversations can engage, enlighten, and encourage more people to work in larger groups that kind of push the systemic change. It's important to build bridges and not walls. There's been a lot of talk of walls in the last couple of years, and really, we all have to do our part to work towards the change we wish to see. So this conversation and the conversations like it is to think about looking at what are the root causes of racial hatred and how do we work towards finding solutions. Reprogramming America needs to be a combination of systemic change and these small conversations. So we talked about reprogramming the education system last time. This time we're talking about reprogramming self. And I've invited Sarah, a friend of mine that we served in the Peace Corps together many years ago. We haven't talked for a really long time, and we recently reconnected to talk about this topic. She posted something that I found really engaging and interesting about the history that she found out about her family. And how she thought through and kind of reconciled with that history. So I'm going to welcome her in. Sarah, welcome. Hey. How are you this evening?
I'm doing very well.
Good.
Thank you.
So I don't know if our YouTube connection got online, but the Facebook one did. Mm-hmm. So hopefully enough people are able to see us through Facebook. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to thank you for coming tonight. So Sarah's dialing in from New Orleans, NOLA, where she's lived for how many years?
I feel like 9. I mean, the city that time forgot. Who knows? I feel like around 9 years. I think 9 this winter. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So tell me, what brings you here today? What brought you down this kind of path of self-reflection, self-discovery on race, racism, and your personal responsibility and kind of seeking to understand and take action?
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on the term implicit bias? Mm-hmm. And do you ever recognize or see it within yourself?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, in joining you tonight, and thank you so much for also starting, for starting this program and like dialogue between citizens ourselves. I grew up in an environment that was very much, like parents taught me, everyone is equal, etc. Very like character-based culture. And I remember reading recently in my ethics class for graduate school, we read the book White Fragility together 2 summers ago. And I remember the author, sort of confronting everyone, saying it like it's not enough if you were raised with your parents telling you everyone was equal. Like look at what were the symbols that you were surrounded with growing up? What was the color of everyone in the cartoons that you watched? Like, what was your culture telling you? Not just, a sort of a verbal, like everyone is equal and should have equal opportunity. What were the messages that you got from consumerism, from culture around you? So that sort of a couple summers ago spurred a bit of a deeper look in what my own implicit bias may be. And more recently, I think the post that got your attention was that I had known for a while that I've been related to Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was he was a slave trader, a very brutal and effective Confederate general, and one of the founding members of the KKK. And I recently began reading a pretty in-depth biography on his life. And I'd really wanted to like reckon with that relationship, because growing up, always known we had been related, but what I had heard from my family was, but the KKK wasn't about racism when it started. And that was sort of the depth of, that conversation. And even as a young child, I knew that was wrong. I knew that there was something really missing from that equation. And I started to read the biography, really prepared to label him as a horrible man. And I mean, it turns out kind of, both are true. Like there are a lot of things historically that the biography is citing where he was a very decent and loving and compassionate man in a lot of areas of his life. He also was a very, very brutal and angry man, and one of the founders of the KKK. And he was responsible for a lot of pain, a lot of people's pain. And during this time, it seems like there's a lot of similar arguments was like Thomas Jefferson. Was he all good or all bad? The Confederate statues, there's a lot of this black and white labeling that we have going on, and looking into my own family's history and realizing that, one person can have a lot of sides. One person can have love in their lives, and they can also cause tremendous pain and suffering to others. We're all a work in progress. So being able to hold those two truths, that those two things can be true at the same time, but that we need to look at both of them. We need to honor both of them. To say someone, that the KKK wasn't about racism when it started really denies responsibility for what that has turned into, for the pain that my ancestor also caused. And that's not right. And it's also not right just to label someone as, entirely inherently evil. We all have a lot of different sides. So really wanting to take responsibility for that, and to look at all perspectives, and that it's okay to take responsibility for that. Let's see. I'm having trouble hearing you, Natalie. I don't know if something happened with the audio.
Oh, mute. Okay. So, yeah. So you talked about a person, who has caused great pain, can have a both good and a bad side. And there's going to be people who listen to this and have really struggle believing a person who would have caused pain, suffering, death, torture on other human beings could have good in them, or there could be a way to reconcile the act of buying and selling bodies, or lynching, or whatever would be involved. How do you reconcile yourself? You said you went and you read the book and, learned more about him. How did you kind of dig deep to see the humanity in him,
Mm-hmm.
and have those conversations with your family if you did,
Mm-hmm.
around that.
Yeah. I haven't finished the book yet. I'm about a third of the way through.
Mm-hmm.
I did start the biography. I did start reading it, really prepared to completely debunk any claim that Nathan Bedford Forrest had a good bone in his body. I mean, really, I was talking about out loud to myself, reading it like, bullshit and this and this and this, but really needing to, I think it's a pretty unbiased author. And I'm not there in the book yet. At the end of his life, he really, there's a lot of record of him becoming a very strong advocate for equal rights, and denouncing what the KKK turned into. Um, Again, I haven't gotten to that part of the book yet. I think it's very dangerous to hold anything like that out there as a trinket of, oh, but see, it's okay, because it's
Mm-hmm.
not okay. Once again, that, even, as young kids, if we even unintentionally hurt someone,
Mm-hmm.
like everything pauses and we take a time out and we we learn about how that hurt somebody else. We say we're sorry, we're led through that process. And I mean, I've known Nathan Bedford Forrest, but I know I'm a very positive woman full of a lot of love. And I've also hurt a lot of people. And there are people in this city who, once they see me walking down the street, they'll turn right around and walk in the other direction. So also, like, knowing my own angels and demons, I have a lot of sides, and I know that I'm complex.
Yeah.
And I think that we all have that.
Okay. What do you think causes that? Like, what do you think is the root of these racial biases or racial hatred in our country?
Mm-hmm. I'm a sort of the spiritual premise that everything is either motivated by love or fear.
Mm-hmm.
And when we get down to it, a lot of racial bias, it's fear of the unknown. It's a fear that we are not enough on our own, who we are. So we need to belittle other people,
Mm-hmm.
in order to feel any sense of importance.
Mm-hmm.
I spent some time listening today to a long podcast featuring Daryl Davis, who's a Black musician who is responsible for about 200 members of the KKK actually turning in their robes and leaving the organization because they no longer believe in racial inequality. And Daryl does this through conversations, sort of befriending them and not taking personally their racial hatred, but like compassionately re-educating them.
Mm-hmm.
And Daryl, there's a beautiful part in the podcast where he breaks down, a lot of the racial hatred comes from fear and ignorance. But ignorance is something that we can work on. It's something that we can remedy through education and through relationships.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For sure. When you talk about fear as kind of one of the root causes. So, I mean, you're here today. It took courage to come and sit in front of whoever's watching and talk
Mm-hmm.
about race. So how do you push as a white woman or self-identified? I know you have other identities that you identify with too, but the world identifies you as a white woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you push through that fear, or if you experience white guilt? A lot of people are kind of at home or thinking, okay, yes, I'm a white person. Maybe I did benefit from privilege, but what do I do about it?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you turn that fear, guilt, or whatever it is into action, into working
Mm-hmm.
towards the betterment of our communities?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I can see there's a woman, Wendy Brown, is also having a comment about, me as a white woman, benefiting from, from the wealth that was passed down and the obligation to have conversations with my family, which I absolutely agree with. Absolutely. I'm taking extremely stringent notes on everything in the biography to type up and send out to my family. And in terms of things that we can do, there's a moment of reckoning with my conscience this summer. seeing the strength of the Black Lives Matter movement and realizing how much I had been in the dark and allowed myself to stay in the dark about the reality of day-to-day racial inequalities in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And such a strong moment of conscience that I know that like the rest of my life needs to be about that. So for me, learning how to have and developing the commitment and the courage to have those conversations every time an opportunity for them comes up.
Mm-hmm.
Not just when an opportunity comes up, but like, so I'm speaking for me with my fellow white citizens, family members, etc. Having those conversations, challenging every implicit bias that might come up, looking without reserve in my own life, you know, for where I have those, with a lot of humility, asking questions, asking to be corrected, from my friends of color. If I say anything that seems to be biased, you know, please let me know. I think that willingness to learn and that humility and willingness to be vulnerable is really important. And it's really important that, like, myself as a white person, I become a committed learner.
Mm-hmm.
Really engage in conversations with fellow white citizens. I spend a lot of time right now online on Facebook doing that and trying to talk with people and challenge racism in a way that is intelligent and not just, you know, full of hate, but just like how we all contain,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we all contain different parts of ourselves. And for my friends from high school, you know, who were Trump supporters, there are also parents who totally love their kids, you know, and they have rational sides of them, and we can't reach that when we condemn or we belittle. So I think also staying away from letting any sort of arrogant attitude come in place. Like, oh, like I'm enlightened now, like I'm not racist now, like I don't have any more bias now, but you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you never really arrive, do you? And, you know, you talked about being in the dark. And so, you know, there's some folks that don't understand this concept of implicit bias or unconscious bias, or knowing how you two play a role by doing nothing outrightly, whatever outright racism means to whoever. I'm reading this book right now. It's called Caste, by Isabel Wilkerson. It's on the Oprah's Book Club. And it's an incredible way of breaking down our system into, she changes the words of like white, black, and race to a caste system. So the dominant caste, which is the equivalent of white, and the subordinate caste on the lowest rung, which is black, and then all the other races in between. And she talks about unconscious bias and says, by adulthood, researchers have found most Americans have been exposed to a culture with enough negative messages about African Americans and other marginalized groups that as much as 80% of white Americans hold unconscious bias against Black Americans. So automatic that it kicks in before a person can process it, according to Harvard sociologists. This discriminatory behavior is activated more quickly and effortlessly than conscious discrimination, more quickly than saying, I've decided to discriminate against. And part of this, what is dangerous about it is these automatic responses contribute to disparities in health, in hiring, and housing, and education, and in medical treatment for Black and brown people. So I asked earlier, and I don't think we got that deep into it, what ways do you see that you've experienced or shown implicit or unconscious bias? And how have you kind of worked through that or acknowledged it? Or maybe not, maybe it's a reflection on, you know, now I can see something that I didn't see before. And how do you encourage others to identify that?
One way that kind of pops in my mind with my job, which I lost at the beginning of COVID, but was a pedicab driver for a long time here in New Orleans. And there, I found I had a very strong stereotype that if I had Black customers, then I wouldn't get tipped. And so could feel in my head when I would be carrying Black Americans that I would just like not expect a tip, or, you know, could even feel in my head sort of this sigh, like, oh, you know, oh shit, because I was like thinking about money, and realizing how much I was doing that, with just this stereotype that Black people are cheap. Um, I would then also remember where I come from and where my ancestors come from and the history of slavery in this country. And just realizing that I probably owe every Black person in America all the pedicab rides that they want, like for the rest of their lives. That this equation of giving and taking is not something that happens in a singular moment.
Where do you think you learned that from? Like, where did that thought come from that Black people are cheap?
Sometimes there was like a talk amongst other pedicabbers. There's like a certain weekend in New Orleans, well, that, like Essence Festival, when Essence Festival is here. And it's a time where we tend to have like a lot of rides, but not get a lot of tips. And I think like from that weekend, there was just this then like idea that would carry, throughout the rest of the year. Or if you have an experience, or if like I would hear other pedicabbers who've been there longer than I had, like say that, like, oh, don't really expect to get tips from Black Americans, or it's like a lot more rides and less tips, then I would then tend to look for that experience whenever it happened, and that would like stand out as the dominant reality. So this like feedback loop of hearing something from somebody else, having a similar experience, and then and then this like mutual like confirmation that happened from that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I had a question pop into my head. This is not one of the ones I sent you, but you when we talked about Forrest, your ancestor,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you also talked about Daryl Davis in kind of befriending a KKK to help broaden perspective and change their mind. Do you think that is something that you could see yourself doing in the future?
Oh,
kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, do you mean like specifically with current KKK members, or that aspect of like using compassionate, intelligent dialogue to serve as a bridge?
I think both. I think it doesn't have to be KKK, because, right now there's many white nationalists that believe they're superior to people of color, that do not wear the cape or the hood, right? They walk in broad daylight. They sit in places of high government. They, run businesses. And so, but they reveal themselves in what they think is private settings amongst people who they believe are their equal, right? Settings that I or, my family could never walk into because of the color of our skin, or we could walk into it, but we would never hear the truth, right? And so when you hear somebody say something that is not aligned with your truth, or that shows and reveals themselves as a white supremacist, or even if they are, associated with KKK, how do you break through? Like, what do you think would be the best way forward to interact and engage that person to maybe broaden their perspective?
Awesome. Thank you for explaining more. Yeah, I definitely see that as a big part of my life from here on out. I may have said, I think like as a white person, I see it really as my like undeniable duty to spend a lot of time talking with other white Americans about racism and about bias and about prejudice, and to do so from a standpoint that is not irrevocably condemning, but from a way that tries to serve as a bridge, and that tries to leave room for change. So yeah, absolutely. And I spend a decent amount of time doing that right now. I'm studying clinical mental health counseling, which is particularly useful, I'm finding, with conversations. The two things that they teach us in counseling, really, your two main tools are like reflection. So like repeating back what someone has said, so that they know that they have been heard. and then they can clarify what they mean if needed. So there's that reflection, and then there's pointing out contradictions, which is really what also Daryl Davis did and does in a lot of his work. So we can never, it doesn't work if we just tell someone blatantly you're wrong. I mean, even the best of us are, our egos flare up and we shut down. But what we can do is point out, I hear you saying A, but I also hear you saying B, and those don't, how can both of those be true at the same time? And then give that back to the person to then explain, to break down. Sometimes they can, and then you volley that back. But there often comes a point where, like, all of hatred is full of holes and contradictions. So what I can do is I can offer a space to have safe conversations with a number of my fellow predominantly white Americans about what they think and why, where they don't feel threatened by me, they don't feel judged. However, there is a compassionate challenge in terms of, I hear you saying this. So if this is true, can you explain to me, why this other thing is okay? And so someone's own rationality, they can decide, to look at that and say, okay, those things actually don't match. Let me rethink this and keep volleying. Or there are some people who will just say, oh, but I don't care. I don't care. I'm going to believe that anyways. And that's a separate category of people who are not there yet.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. And just to mention, I know whoever's watching, this is a conversation with us, but it's also a conversation with you. So feel free to drop comments, questions. If you have a question for Sarah or myself into the chat, if you have a thought on how to create change and racial hatred, if you're inspired to do something and want to share with others, please put it in the chat. I think, Sarah, one of my last questions is, what would you say to, young or old or aging white women, men, or people of the dominant caste, as Isabel Wilkerson would say, who are well-meaning or consider themselves well-meaning, consider themselves to not be racist, but may benefit from white privilege or have unconscious biases? What would you say to them is something that they could do within their sphere of influence to work towards ending racial hatred? Hard question, I know. Give her Fran's email. Okay, Ema. We have this friend, Fran Smith, who does this work, anti-racist work. She's amazing.
Yeah. So much of this to me seems to be broken down into relationships, and it's all about our relationships with each other, and the values that are reflected within those relationships. I mean, everything else comes out of that. And I know that all of us have relationships with people where they're, where there is bias, where we still have bias. I think being committed to having conversations and to also, as you said, like Daryl Davis is just like, really putting himself out there to invite conversations with people who think differently. And maybe this is just like because of what I have thought is my place within this work for now. So this is what it's dominant in my mind. But yeah, I think all of our relationships are so important. And so to really like to put yourself out there where you can be.
It's okay if you don't have an answer. There's many who've come before you that do not have an answer. Yeah, I think, but I hear what you're saying. Be open to conversations. And, it's not only about white people. It's also about each person, right? As a Black woman, it is exhausting to talk about race. I've been talking about race at work, at home. And I choose this. It's kind of like self-torture to myself because I don't want to do nothing. I feel like whoever I talk to and sees me as human and gains rapport and builds respect for me and knows about my beautiful Black boy son who will soon grow up into a man who will be who will appear to be threatening to some, but will always be my little boy. That it's really important that I show up while I still have the energy, and I show up for him mostly, because I do feel, even if it doesn't happen in my lifetime or my generation, it could happen in his generation. And I feel like both of us, or all of us, white, Black, everybody has to work within our power of influence. We have to, bridge gaps. We have to find the strength to talk to white folks sometimes and help understand, but we don't have to be the only, and then we don't have to too. Like, there's people who've tried that for years and years and are tired. White folks also have the responsibility to educate self, so that we don't always have to kind of come in and help educate as Black people. And as you educate yourself, and as your friends educate themselves, to tell their friends and get the courage to talk to their racist uncles and aunties, or whoever could be inflicting some of these microaggressions or biases or outright racism on other people, to change and shift their perspective. I think part of this moment that we're living in, since George Floyd, everybody watched as he was lynched before America, is that people are finally, it's revealed, something that I've known my whole life and have lived with, something that people have brought up in several spaces and it's been denied. It's revealed. And I think the powers that be are recognizing that and trying to find ways to squash the learning and to stop the understanding, but we have to keep it going, whether it's grassroots, underground. So that's why I have these chats. That's why I invited you. I'm going to have more chats. So if there are folks in the chat, I talked about reprogramming America. We have to we can break down the huge, seemingly unbreakable problem of racism into smaller bits and pieces when we think about what is our root causes of racism in our country, and think about solutions towards them. So today we talked about self. Last time we talked about education. If folks have ideas about other root causes, they think, and maybe if you have any, Sarah, too, that you'd like to hear us talk about, please drop it in the chat or send me a private message later on to let me know if I think about what the next topic is coming up. What about you, Sarah? Anything off the top of your head?
In terms of
we close,
root causes of racism?
Yeah, and things you think we should talk about in this type of space.
There is I think you're just so on it in terms of understanding and how we all need to continue to increase our understanding. There's a book that I started on tape recently called Stamped from the Beginning. And I forget the author's name, but the author
Ibram Kendi.
Through what's that?
Ibram Kendi.
Ibram Kendi. And so he's talking about how there's this idea that racism, begins from an internal hatred, and that's where it all stems from. But it really has been, and I'm learning more about how much racism has been tied to economics in America and the development of capitalism as we know it, and it's as well as the church. And so there have been a number of other forces that have really bent and twisted to form the experience that we're having now. So I'm curious how the Christian church and its responsibility for, the racism that we experience has been in bed with politics and also the economy, people in certain castes. And we can certainly see that twistedness in terms of spirituality now, where so many conservative Christians, really revere Jesus, who was all about loving your enemy, and who was also Black and who wouldn't be saying anything that, people are saying now. So there's such a massive contradiction there. That
you believe Jesus is Black?
Northern.
I'm just kidding. I know. I'm just kidding.
Hey.
I do too. I believe Jesus is black too. There's a lot of people who still don't.
Yeah. Like that dishonesty within that religious establishment on its own is so deep. And there's such a level of denial within such a spiritual context. Like that's a reckoning that we can see why people are being so violent, trying to keep it away. So looking at racism, I'm really curious because it also has to do with the solutions to it, but like how politics and Christian religion in the United States and economics have like all been sort of working to create this false idea of equality.
Christianity. That's a very taboo topic, but maybe we can tackle it. Kojo, how you doing? Thanks for joining. So Kojo says the lack of self-awareness in African people globally. Yes, definitely. I see myself as a Pan-Africanist. I travel the globe and find my people everywhere. And there's a lack of connection and awareness of how we're connected around the world. And the fact that everybody is in fact African, as we all rooted from the same land, even though we've separated our castes into different systems. So yeah, self-awareness, and maybe focusing even one of these reprogramming of self on Black people. You said we don't take time to reach out to our elders and ask questions. That is true. That is true. That's a good idea. Maybe next time I invite an elder to talk about experiencing, race and caste in another time, but within the country, and what can we learn about it, and figure out ways to reprogram America in that way. So good. So I think that's all I had. Any last messages, Sarah, you want to share with folks that are watching before we close tonight?
No, just thank you so much. And there's so much going on in the country and so many things that it can be so easy to, so many reasons it can be easy to lose heart. But like looking around me here and reconnecting with people like you, and even, just from this small time, Wendy Kojo Kwame, it gives me a whole lot of hope because we're the next generation and also a very big part of this country.
Absolutely.
And informing its direction. So, yeah, I'm in it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining and being willing to talk to me about this, Sarah. I really appreciate you. And thanks everyone for joining. I am going to sit back and do some planning and then bring back another one in the near future. So stay tuned. I'll send out, and we'll have YouTube up and running the next time, but we will post this Facebook conversation to YouTube as well so that people can see it there in the replay. Thank you and have a good evening.
Awesome. Take care.
You too.